We've reached day 3 of Duskmourn spoilers, and this set keeps getting wilder. Today we get some ridiculously pushed Leylines, one of the craziest ramp spells I think I've ever seen, and about a million other cards. It's gonna be a long one. Let's break it down. Hello everyone, it's Seth, probably better known as Saffron Olive, and it's time for another daily dose of Duskmourn spoilers. And it's been a weird spoiler season so far. Cards have been coming at a really odd pace. Like, some days we hardly get any spoilers, and then some days we get like a million spoilers. Today is one of those million spoilers days. We have like half the set to talk about today, which means we should probably jump right into it, start talking about these super sweet new cards. Before we do, a couple of quick reminders. First, if you need any of these cards, you can pre-order them from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. Second, to keep up on all the latest spoilers throughout the day, you should mosey on over to MTGpreviews.com. Anyway, let's talk some Duskmourn. First up today, we get the long-awaited sequel to the banned in standard Meathook Massacre in Meathook Massacre II. And like most sequels, Meathook Massacre II, not as good as the original, a little bit bloated, a little bit overcosted, but arguably way more fun than the original. So it's 4 black and double X, so literally double the cost of Meathook Massacre. When it enters, each player sacks X creatures. Then, when a creature you control dies, you can pay 3 life. If you do, you return it under your control with a finality counter, and when a creature your opponent controls dies, they may pay 3 life. If they don't, return it under your control with a finality counter. So Meathook Massacre 2, very different than the original. The original was a relatively efficient sweeper that also worked like a blood artist. Meathook Massacre 2, definitely not very efficient. It's a ton of mana to make anyone sacrifice. It's 6 mana to make each player sack a single creature. So the power of this card isn't in its edict mode, I don't think. I think it's in its static abilities, just sitting out and making it so whenever one of your creatures dies, you can pay 3 life to get it back. Whenever one of your opponent's creatures dies, they gotta pay some life. If they don't, you're gonna get it back. I think that's the real power of the card, because if you think about edicts, the going rate for an edict is like 2 mana. This is 6 mana, and it makes you sack a creature. If you just want to edict things, you can Season of Loss for 5 mana, and make each player sack up to 5 creatures. So, as an edict, Meathook Massacre is just way overcosted, but as an enchantment sitting on the battlefield, the card actually seems kind of ridiculous. It's kind of like a souped-up Aetherios, or maybe like a weird Grave Betrayal effect. The fact that every time one of your creatures dies, you can just pay 3 life to get it back, and you're taxing your opponent's life total by making them do the same thing or else you steal their creatures, seems really strong. I think the most common way to play this card is probably going to be to not worry about the X so much and just cast this for 4 mana and then try to like cast removal or wrath the board or have stuff trade off in combat, because it seems incredibly strong as it sits on the battlefield. There is janky combo potential, not super realistic. Like, say you have an Ops and a Baloth in a Bart so you can sack something. You could like sack the Baloth, it's going to come back into play, you gain 4 life, you spend 3 to do it, so you're technically going up 1 life. The problem here is the finality counter. So to really turn this into a combo piece, you need a way to get rid of the finality counter, which means like Solemnity or something, which kind of makes it a 4-card combo, which would be something cool to pull off in a commander deck, I guess, but probably something that's not really going to be competitive in Modern or Pioneer or whatever. In Standard, I think the best thing to do with this card is actually just play mono black. You almost have to be mono black because of the 4 black mana symbols, but play a mono black deck, run this out on 4, on turn 5, just Season the Loss, make everyone sack all their stuff, and then you get all your stuff back. Your opponent's gonna have to pay a ton of life or get their stuff back. So I think this could be standard playable, but it's gonna need a very specific, very black heavy deck. Once you get to older formats, the card gets much better because it's just so much easier for a black deck to make a ton of mana. So like Nykthos Shrine to Nyx, this card seems great in mono black devotion. You can make a ton of mana with Nykthos to cast it and up the X cost, or it's just 4 black mana symbols on the battlefield, so it's gonna up the mana of Nykthos by a ton. Or like Cabal Coffers makes a ton of mana. So if you're playing Pioneer, Modern, or Commander, it's pretty realistic that you can just make 10 or 20 mana in your black deck and dump it all into this and turn it into a weird wrath that might steal you a bunch of creatures. Plus, mono black decks in Commander and older formats have cards like Grey Merchant, Exsanguinate that can gain back a lot of life, so you're pretty safe to take and dump all your life into getting your creatures back with Meathook Massacre, knowing that you're going to have ways to gain all that life back anyway. So I think the primary home for this card, probably going to be big mana black commander decks. I mean, I'm going to try building around it in standard just because it seems really fun, but I think in like a Carrot deck or an Erebos deck, you can either make a ton of mana and use this as a Wrath, or just run it down on 4 without paying X at all, and then use Damnation or Toxic Deluge to sweep the board and get a ton of triggers, and then you're either building a massive board or making your opponents pay a ton of life, so it seems very powerful there. So Meathook Massacre II, I actually really love this card. It's nowhere near as good as Meathook Massacre, but that's a good thing, I think, because the original Meathook Massacre was probably a little too good, which led to it getting banned in Standard, rebalanced on Magic Arena. This seems incredibly fun, though. I am super excited to build around it, because it just seems like a really cool card to have on the battlefield and try to steal all your opponent's creatures. So even though it's a little bloated, a little bit expensive, I still really like this card. We also got a new Niko in Niko Light of Hope. So, new Niko, 4 mana Azorius 3/4 legendary human wizard. When it enters, you create 2 shard tokens, which are enchantment tokens, and you pay 2 Zach to scry 1 and draw a card. So kind of like upgraded clues that are enchantments essentially. And then you can pay 2 and tap it to exile target non-legendary creature you control. Shards you control become copies of it until the beginning of your next end step, and then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So Niko, it's a really weird card. So its second ability of like blinking something and turning your shards into it, that's a really interesting build around effect that I think can do some cool things. As far as standard is concerned though, a 4 mana 3/4 that just makes 2 shards that you can draw cards with in the future doesn't seem that bad, especially in a standard. We're gonna have Eerie that just cares about enchantments entering the battlefield that powers up those synergies really nicely. So I think that there's an argument that Niko could maybe see some play in standard just as mostly a fair card, just like this okay body that makes a couple shards and supports your synergies. The second ability, I think, is gonna make it really interesting in Commander, where it's kind of like a Rune the Hidden Realm with some weird shenanigans, since you can turn shards into the thing that you blink. The one downside of this is shards are not exactly easy to make. Outside of new Niko, the only card in Magic that makes a shard is old Niko, Niko Eris, so there's not a way you can really flood the board with shard tokens, which means the second ability mostly going to be making 2 copies of that creature, turning 2 shards into copies of that creature. Although you can do things like try to clone your Niko or proliferate the tokens, which might be the best way to build around this. Like if you have an Anointed Procession and you Niko, you're going to get 4 shards instead of 2, or your Rootborn defenses to populate your shards, or maybe a Doppelgang to copy your Niko or copy your shards, instead of this huge turn where you blink one thing and turn like 5 shards or 10 shards into a copy of it. Seems like it could be super hilarious. Also works really well with Spark Double or Helm of the Host, any way to just keep copying Niko to make more shards, because the more shards you get, the more powerful that blink ability is going to be. So what do you do with the blink ability? So first, very important to point out, the shards are already on the battlefield, so it doesn't work especially well with ETB triggers, which is kind of counterintuitive, because normally in a blink deck, you want ETB triggers, because the thing that you blink, you're going to reuse the ETB. So let's say you have a Muldrifter out. You blink it with Niko, your shards become Muldrifters. They're just 2/2s with flying. They don't draw you cards or anything. You will draw when the original Muldrifter returns on your end step, but still, I don't think that's the best use of this card. And that's the thing that makes Niko so intriguing, is it's this blink card that doesn't really work that well with the traditional blink targets. I think what this actually works incredibly well with is things that have combat damage triggers, attack triggers, like Drogskull Reaver, for example, this 7 mana 3/5 that's flying double strike and lifelink, and whenever you gain life, you draw a card. So let's say you have just the baseline 2 shards from playing a Niko, and then you blink a Drogskull Reaver, you're going to get 2 Drogskull Reavers. They can deal up to 6 damage, and they're each going to trigger each other, and since they have lifelink, you're going to gain 6 life with each of them, which is drawing 12 cards. Like, it's kind of absurd. You just like generate a huge amount of card advantage, gain a ton of life, get in a huge amount of damage. And remember, that's the baseline. That is the, I only have 2 shards. If you're doing the shenanigans we're talking about of spark doubling and blinking Niko Eris to make a bunch of shards, you could just draw your entire deck with this. Or like Angel of Destiny. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, you and that player gain that much life. And the beginning of your end step, if you have at least 15 more life than your starting life total, each player that it attacked loses the game. So you can get on an Angel of Destiny with Niko, blink it, turn all of your shards into Angels of Destinies, you attack with everything, everything, you're going to gain an absurd amount of life from the Angel of Destiny's attacking, and if you just attack each of your opponents, you're going to win the game on the spot. Or like Enduring Curiosity. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage to a player, draw a card. Imagine stacking up 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of those with Niko's ability. You're just going to draw so many cards. There's Sun Titan to reanimate everything. So I really love the design of this card. I think this is a super cool commander, and I love that it's kind of a blink deck, but it's a blink deck that doesn't work with the traditional dirtily blink things, and instead is going to want you to play these weird cards. Like, I honestly think Angel of Destiny might be the best card in a Niko deck, which is something I would never even consider playing in a Rune deck or a traditional blink deck. So Niko, I like this card. It seems like a super fun against the odds card in Standard, where we just see how many shards we can make and then turn them all into a creature and use that to win the game. It's going to be really sweet against the odds card in Standard. Might be fine is a fair card in Standard, just in decks that care about enchantments entering the battlefield or want the shard tokens, and then you get the upside of having this super unique, really spicy commander that I think is going to be pretty powerful. We also got our blue mythic impending creature in Overlord of the Floodpits. So Overlord of the Floodpits, 5 mana 5/3, Avatar Horror, has impending 4 for 3 mana. It is flying, and when it enters or attacks, draw 2 cards and discard a card. So Overlord of the Floodpits, it just seems solid. Like, it's a solid enough creature. 3 mana to draw 2 and discard 1 is fine. If you get 5 mana, you can just get the big flyer with it. Its body's not exciting, but it's reasonable enough. It's like a Stoic Sphinx or a Glyph Keeper. 5 power in the air. If your opponent can't kill it or block it, is a relatively fast clock, so its stats are okay. Its ability kind of reminds me of 3 Steps Ahead in a weird way. Its card draw ability, draw 2 and discard a card, is literally the same, and then if you get up to 5 mana, it's kind of like you add in the creature copying ability of 3 Steps Ahead, where you get a body too. So I think that Overlord of the Floodpits certainly serves a purpose. It reminds me a little bit of Steamcore Scholar, Champion of Wits. It's literally, I guess, a catalog as an enchantment at sorcery speed. But if you're playing a deck that wants to fill your graveyard, it just seems fine. Like, the 3 mana mode's fine, the 5 mana mode's fine, its body's fine. Nothing like super splashy or exciting, but it just seems like a reasonable card for like Reanimator, let's say. If you're trying to get an Atrox in the graveyard for your Cruelty of Gix, this gets the job done, and it has some flexibility, and it can even be a reanimation target. Obviously, you'd rather be reanimating Atroxa, but in a pinch, getting back a 5/3 and drawing a couple more cards, filling your graveyard, seems reasonable. So Overlord of the Floodpits, not like super hyped for this card or anything, but I like creatures that ETB draw cards. Good with Panharmonicon effects, good in Value-y style decks, good in Reanimator style decks. So maybe not the splashiest of the Overlords, but it seems just like a solid addition to decks. We also got a new black mythic room enchantment in Funeral Room / Awakening Hall. So Funeral Room, 3 mana. It says whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses a life and you gain a life. Awakening Hall is 8 mana, and it says when you unlock this door, return all creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. So this room is essentially a Bastion of Remembrance. The downside is you don't get the 1/1 token. Otherwise it works exactly like Bastion of Remembrance, but you get the upside of having Awakening Halls, which is kind of like a Rise of the Dark Realms, or I guess an Eerie Ultimatum, something along those lines. It only hits your graveyard, which is important to point out. You're not reanimating your opponent's creatures, but you can literally reanimate all of your creatures for 8 mana, which is a big cost, but I think because you can play the 3 mana mode, it's kind of fine. You play it for 3 mana, get the Bastion of Remembrance, and then eventually get to 8 mana and just win the game. So I'm kind of hyped about this card in future Standard, because it gives us another Blood Artist effect. We know we're getting Vengeful Blood Witch in Foundations in November. Now we have Funeral Room is an enchantment version of Blood Artist. We already have a Sack Outlet in Bar, so I think maybe we could play some sort of Aristocrat deck. And in Aristocrats, this card is so incredibly good, because not only is it giving you a arguably bad Blood Artist effect, but the second half, the Awakening Halls, is just game ending. It kind of gives you a Rally the Ancestors. It is a lot of mana, but imagine playing an Aristocrat style deck where you get down Funeral Room early and you're just generating value as you sacrifice your stuff and get things set up. Then eventually you get to 8 mana and you just get all your creatures back, and you probably just win the game. You just get all your creatures back, you sack all your creatures, just like we used to do with Rally the Ancestors, and close out the game on the spot. So if you're an Aristocrat style deck, I feel like this card's kind of an auto include, because the cheap side is good enough on its own that if you never get to 8 mana, it's fine, and if you do get to 8 mana, you should just win the game unless your graveyard's locked down. We have seen in Standard Bringer the Last Gift, which is 8 mana, everyone sacks their stuff, everyone reanimates everything, hasn't really seen any play, so I'm not sure you would build a deck just around Awakening Halls. So I think you build your deck around Funeral Rooms, and then Awakening Halls is like this late game upside that you get as a bonus on your Funeral Room. So I think that's probably the direction this goes, although you could build a deck around getting to Awakening Halls if you want to. We have like Collector's Vault, which fills your graveyard and makes treasures. We have Heaped Harvest, which can double ramp you. So if you do just want to try to turbo up to 8 mana and fill your graveyard, this is kind of cute. Is it better than just like Breaching the Multiverse or something? Maybe not in every deck, but still, it is cool that you can just reanimate everything. In Commander, I feel like this card is really good in specifically Aristocrat style decks like Caesar or Tisa Karlov or Yawgmoth, but it also could be good in Reanimator decks. In Reanimator decks, you're mostly playing it for the Awakening Hall side, but imagine like Dahada, which can make a ton of mana, or Kroxan Kunaro Sephiroth, where you play this early just to like gain a little life, have a Blood Artist on the battlefield, and make sure you don't die before you get up to 8 mana, and then once you get to 8 mana, this is going to be a huge swing in the game. So Funeral Room Awakening Hall seems really solid. Excited to try some aristocrating in Standard, and if you're playing an aristocrat style deck or a reanimator deck in Commander, I think this is at least worth considering, even though the backside is kind of expensive. Speaking of rooms, we also got what is probably the first against odds card from the set in Central Elevator / Promising Stairs. So this is a rare mono blue room enchantment. The first side, Central Elevator, 4 mana. When you unlock it, you can search your library for a room card that doesn't have the same name is a room you already control, put it in your hand and then shuffle. So 4 mana Room Tutor, and then Promising Stairs, 3 mana. At the beginning of your upkeep, surveil 1, and you win the game if there are 8 or more different names among unlocked doors of rooms you control. So essentially, get 8 rooms on the battlefield, win the game on your upkeep. So is this card going to be good? Probably not. I don't know, maybe they'll actually be a room deck. It would be super cool if rooms was like a tier standard archetype. My guess is this is a really cool alt win con for room commander decks, and gonna be a really fun against the odds card to take the challenge. How realistic is it to get 8 different open rooms on the battlefield? This does help, right? Because you can tutor up a room that you don't already have, so it does help support itself, but still, that's a lot of permanence to get on the battlefield and not get hit by removal or some sort of enchantment sweeper, which we haven't really seen yet, but I don't know, cease and desist or something. So I'm excited to build around the card. I expect this is mostly living in the realm of janky against odds cards though, but it should be a really fun build around. We also got some new Leylines and a reprinted Leyline, starting with Leyline of the Void. We know this one. Every time they reprint Leylines, it seems like Black just gets Leyline of the Void again, because Leyline of the Void's really good. Sees play all the way back to Vintage, I think. It's just really good in every format, making it so if a card would go into your opponent's graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead, and it'll be interesting to see just how impactful this is in our standard format. So there are very strong graveyard decks. We got Conspiracy Unraveler combo decks, we got Atroxa decks, we got Funeral Room Awakening Halls now, we got Cruelty of Gix decks. So there are very strong linear graveyard decks, and Leyline of the Void is one of the best answers ever printed to deal with graveyard decks. The question's gonna be, is it better than something like Tranquil Frillback that has more flexibility, even if it's worse at exiling the graveyard? So we'll have to wait and see, but Leyline of the Void, it's a card that I am always glad is around, because graveyard decks are really powerful and they're difficult to hate on, and it's good to know that you have a really strong hate piece to deal with them. Leyline of Resonance. Oh my god, this card is scary. It's a 4 mana red Leyline, so it can start on the battlefield if it's in your opening hand. And it says whenever you cast an instant sorcery spell that targets only a single creature you control, copy that spell. You can choose new targets for the copy. So why is this card so incredibly scary? Well, the answer is it works really well with what red decks and Gruul decks and Rakdos decks are already trying to do in Standard, which is throw pump spells at things like Heartfire Hero, Cacophony Scamp, Slickshot Show Off. Like, Monstrous Rage is already ridiculous. +2/+0, plus you get the Monstrous Roll, it's +1/+1, and that's going to stick around, and it's going to give Trample because of the Monstrous Roll. Imagine getting 2 of those instead of 1 whenever you cast it. We've seen with Leyline of the Guild Pact that being on a Leyline can push an effect from being pretty janky and unplayable to being very scary, just because it speeds it up so much. And this is a card that I think opens up just turn 2 kills in Standard. Like, imagine this. It's actually pretty simple. Turn 0, you play your Leyline. Turn 1, you play Cacophony Scamp. On turn 2, you go turn inside out, you double it up. So that's going to give the Scamp +6/+0, and when it dies, you manifest Dread, not really relevant. And then he casts a Monstrous Rage, which is going to give +6/+2, and also give Trample. So the end result is going to be you have a 13 power Trampling Cacophony Scamp that when it hits your opponent and gets it a bunch of damage, you sacrifice it, deal damage equal to its power. That's a pretty straightforward turn 2 kill that didn't exist before Leyline of Resonance was a thing. So I think even just that is incredibly scary, like how fast this can make people die. So I think this is going to see play in Standard, and I think it can actually see play outside of Standard as well. We've seen it with Leyline of the Guild Pack, as I mentioned before, and there are these prowess decks in formats like Pioneer, in formats like Modern, and in those formats, even more so than Standard, being as fast as possible is super, super key. So if Leyline of Resonance can speed up your Modern prowess deck by an entire turn cycle, or your Pioneer prowess deck by an entire turn cycle, that is more than enough to make it worth playing this kind of clunky card that if you draw it off the top in the mid game, you don't really want to cast for 4 mana. So I think we'll see it in those formats as well. In Commander, it seems really good in Feather. I expect people will probably play it in Zada, although it's not as good with Zada as you think. It's worth keeping in mind that the copy that you get isn't actually cast. So like Zada triggers, whenever you cast the instant or sorcery spell that only targets it, you get a copy for all your other stuff. So let's say you have a Leyline of Resonance out, you cast a whatever, Monstrous Rage on your Zada, you'll get a copy for each of your creatures, which is kind of wild, and then you'll get an additional copy with Leyline, but that copy is not being cast, so even if you target Zada with the copy, it's not going to trigger it and give it to all your things again. But I think those are the kind of decks. If you're targeting your own creatures with protection spells and pump spells, Leyline just doubles them up. It's like Pump Spell a Monicon, essentially, which is a really scary effect. So Leyline of Resonance, I'm actually kind of scared that they printed this card. I think this card's kind of wild and stronger than I expected it to be. I would be surprised if we were not seeing turn 2 kills with this in Standard, and I think it also has potential all the way back to Modern at a minimum. We also got Leyline of Transformation, and this is another one that I think has a scary amount of potential. So this is our blue Leyline. 4 mana, you can start with it in play if it's in your opening hand. As it enters, you choose a creature type, and creatures you control are the chosen type in addition to their other type. The same is true for creature spells you control, and also creature cards that you own that aren't on the battlefield. So essentially, all your creatures are going to gain whatever creature type you choose. So if this sounds familiar, there are other cards that do this, right? We have Arcane Adaptation, which does the same exact thing. The difference here is Leyline of Transformation can start on the battlefield if you have it in your opening hand, and the difference between being free and having to pay even 3 mana for the effect is huge. It is a huge, huge deal, especially in older formats. So what do we actually do with this card? And first, I should say, this is like the worst use of this card, and I don't even know if you should do this with the card, but it can make any creature work in your tribal deck. Let's say you're playing elementals and you got a Risen Reef, which triggers whenever another elemental enters the battlefield, but you have some non-elemental creatures in your deck. Leyline of Transformation can make sure that all your creatures are elementals to trigger Risen Reef, or all your creatures are dwarves to make treasures with Magda, or all your creatures are the same type to make a ton of mana with 3 Tree City. I will warn you though, that the idea of being like, I'm a Merfolk deck, but I want to play a bunch of cool non-Merfolk in my deck, so I'll just play Leyline of Transformation to make them all into Merfolk, that's not usually a successful way to build a deck. Because the problem is, if you don't draw Leyline or Arcane Adaptation or whatever, everything falls apart, and you're playing a bunch of, I don't know, elves in your Risen Reef deck, or playing a bunch of zombies in your Magda deck, and things are just really, really bad. So I would discourage this. I think the real power of this card is as a combo piece. So how do you combo with this card? And one thing I'm excited about, and the first thing I want to try in Standard with this card, is Valley Flood Color combo. So I've been trying to build Valley Flood Color combo ever since Valley Flood Color released. Valley Flood Color, it's a 3-drop otter that makes it so whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you get to pump your birds, otters, rats, and frogs and untap them. And the way to combo with this is like Jeskai Ascendancy, where you need creatures that make mana, and then you cast a spell. Well, first you float all the mana with your creatures, then you cast a spell, untap them, then you do it again, keep chaining spells, generate infinite-ish mana, make your team super big, win the game somehow. The problem is, there's just not enough birds, frogs, otters, and rats to make mana. It's basically Poison Tart Frog, so you just can't really make the combo work because there's not enough creatures of the right type. But now with Leyline of Transformation, we can play Llanowar Loamspeaker, we can play Thorn Vault Forager. It opens up all kinds of possibilities because we can just turn them all into whatever, otters or frogs or birds, choose one of Valley Flood Color colors, creature types. So I think that might create a brand new deck in Standard, this new combo deck with Valley Floodcaller, because it seems very easy to pop off with this deck if you have enough mana dorks, so they're the right types. Now Leyline of Transformation makes that happen. It's also super cute with Kaido. We were talking when Kaido was spoiled about how it's really odd that it cares so much about ninjas, but we don't really have ninjas in Standard. The emblem of +1/+1 for all your ninjas seems incredibly busted if you have a bunch of ninjas, which we just don't have in Standard. But now Leyline of Transformation can make everything a ninja, which means that emblem is going to be pumping all your creatures, and that turns Kaido from being like, let's wait and see if we get more ninjas, into, wow, this card seems busted. We can also do tricks like Realm Breaker, which is still in Standard. Realm Breaker for 10 mana, you sacrifice it, search your library for any number of Praetor cards, put them on the battlefield. The problem is, Praetors are kind of clunky, and it's hard to put a bunch of them in a deck. But with Leyline of Transformation, your Realm Breaker can just get every creature from your deck. It also opens up a new infinite sack combo in Standard with Bart and Wick. So Wick says, whenever it or another rat you control enters, create a 1/1 black snail creature token if you don't control a snail, otherwise you put a counter on the snail. So the trick here is, if we name rat with Leyline, the snail will also be a rat, so we can like play Wick, which will create the snail token, which is a rat. That will trigger Wick, and then we can sacrifice the snail before the Wick trigger resolves, which will let Wick make another snail rather than putting counter on the snail. And then we do it again, and then we do it again. If we throw in a Blood Artist effect or that new Room Blood Artist, we win the game. We get an infinitely big Bart. We have infinite things leaving the battlefield, infinite things dying, infinite things entering the battlefield. So another possibility in Standard, maybe the best use of this in Modern, is going to be Wirewood Symbiote, which is another example of how going from 3 mana like Arcane Adaptation to free is just such a huge deal. So the trick here is Wirewood Symbiote, this 1/1 insect that says return an elf you control to its owner's hand, untap target creature, activate this only once a turn. So Wirewood Symbiote, really good in elf decks, but it itself is not an elf. If we can make Wirewood Symbiote an elf with Leyline of Transformation, then what we can do is pick Wirewood Symbiote up to its own ability. So we play the Symbiote, we can untap an elf and bounce Symbiote back to our hand because it now is an elf, and then we can recast it. So let's say we have a Llanowar Elves. What we can do is tap the Llanowar Elves for a mana, then we can activate Wirewood Symbiote, bounce Symbiote back to our hand, untap the Llanowar Elves, then we can tap the Llanowar Elves for a mana, recast the Symbiote. Since Symbiote is a new version of itself, we can use its ability again. So this would give us infinite enters the battlefield and leaves the battlefield triggers. If we can have something that makes multiple mana though, like Heritage Druid with Nettle Sentinel with this loop, then we just go infinite as quick as turn 2. So let's say we have Heritage Druid, Nettle Sentinel, Wirewood Symbiote, and we got the Leyline out. What we can do is tap all 3 of our creatures to make 3 mana. Then we can bounce Wirewood Symbiote back to our hand using its ability, because it's an elf now, to untap the Heritage Druid. Then we cast the Wirewood Symbiote for 1 of our 3 green mana. It's going to untap the Nettle Sentinel. Now we have an untapped Wirewood Symbiote, an untapped Heritage Druid, an untapped Nettle Sentinel. We tap all 3 again, make 3 more mana. Then we Wirewood Symbiote back to our hand. And this can happen on turn 2. Turn 0 Leyline, turn 1 Wirewood Symbiote, turn 2 Heritage Druid, Nettle Sentinel, infinite mana. Infinite mana in Modern, dump our hand, find the Crater Hoof, win the game with our elves, whatever we're trying to do with it. There's also near infinite commander combos with this card. Malcolm Keen Eyes, Reckless Fireweaver. Turn all your stuff into a pirate, so then when Malcolm makes a treasure, it triggers Reckless Fireweaver, which is going to be a pirate now to deal a damage, which will trigger Malcolm to make a treasure, which will trigger Fireweaver. We already talked about Wick in Standard, but you can do the same shenanigans with like Phyrexian Altar to make infinite mana rather than just growing Bart. Really good with Bishop of Wings. There's a bunch of combos here, but like Kaikar and Bishop of Wings. The trick is that the tokens that Bishop of Wing makes are normally spirits, but if we can turn them into angels, they'll keep triggering the Bishop of Wing. So then Kaikar can sack this Spirit Angel to make a mana, which will make another Spirit Angel, which will be sacked for a mana, infinite mana, keep doing the loop. And then Higger the Steelwing Time Stream Navigator, one of the jankier combos, but if we can turn Time Stream Navigator into a ninja, we can attack with Higger and then tutor up the Time Stream Navigator and use that to take an extra turn, and then attack with Higger to be able to tutor up the Time Stream Navigator to take another turn. We can even make Higger unblockable with its ability. So all this to say, Leyline of Transformation is awesome. It is one of the coolest cards from the set. There's a ton of combo potential, and I'm really high on these Leylines because I really truly believe that it changes the equation. Just based on Leyline of the Guild Pact, when I first saw that card, I was like, I don't know, it seems pretty janky. It's, 5 mana if you don't have it for free. But as we've seen, that is a legit all-star in Modern that has created entire archetypes, and I think the same is true here. Just the fact that these effects go from being 3 mana, 4 mana, whatever, to being free, I think is going to let the blue and red Leylines become really powerful combo pieces in various formats, and Leyline of the Void, just a really good hate card that I'm glad is around. Next up, we got a new vehicle in Hedge Shredder, which I think might just be one of the most broken cards that we've seen from the entire set. This card is so ridiculous to me. So it is a 4 mana green 5/5 vehicle. It says when it attacks, you can mill 2 cards, you can crew it for 1. The important text: whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from your library, put them onto the battlefield tapped. That's right, with this on the battlefield, any land that you mill and get into your graveyard from your library comes into play, which makes this one of the most ridiculous ramp spells that I have ever seen. So first off, as a vehicle, the card kind of sucks. These like 4 mana 5/5 vehicles, they never see play, but I don't even care. I'm not planning on attacking with my Hedge Shredder. Like, sure, there's going to be times when the opportunity presents itself. It's nice that the crew cost is only 1. There's no blockers. Your opponent's tapped out. You might as well chip in for 5 damage or use it on defense if you have to. So it is an upside that it's a vehicle. But the scary part of that card is just that second ability. If you mill a land, you get to put it into play. This opens up so many possibilities, and we have literally, as far as I could find, I did some searching on this, literally never had another card that does the same thing. This is the first time we've seen this effect on a Magic card. So what do you do with this card? Well, let's start with standard and super easy examples. You play a Hedge Maze for your Hedge Shredder, you mill a land with Surveil, and you put it into play. That's already ridiculous. Or maybe you cast the Urborg Lurgoyf, and you kick it, and you mill 6 cards, and you hit 3 lands. Well, then you put 3 lands into play tapped. Maybe you have Jace Perfected Mine, and you can mill yourself for 15 cards. That is 1/4 of your deck. You're probably going to mill 6, 7, 8 lands. They all come into play tapped. That is ridiculous. Imagine just like turn 4 Hedge Shredder, turn 5 Jace, max out the milling, put 7 lands into play. That's what this does. That's what this can do. It's like so absurd that they put these words on a Magic card. It's like the most ramp I've ever seen. Works really well with spunking. Then all the lands are going to come into play untapped. That opens up even more combo potential. You can do the Jace thing. All the lands come into play untapped, which means you can immediately cast, let's say, another Jace and mill 15 more cards. So really, really good splunking stuff. It seems really powerful with Iridescent Vine Lasher. That's been one of my pet cards lately, trying to figure out how to make Vine Lasher work. So in the like Aftermath Analyst, Lumra decks, you can just fill up with self-mill and then play your Vine Lasher and just put so many lands into play with Hedge Shredder and mill your opponent out of the game. So it seems really good there as well. Once you get back into Modern, there's even easier combo potential. So this is like best friends with Hedron Crab. Hedron Crab has landfall. When a land enters, you make target player mill 3 cards. So the idea would be, let's say you're running 25 lands. You know what? Let's make it easy. Let's say 30 lands, which I know isn't super realistic, but you could play for this combo. Let's say you're playing 30 lands in your deck. What you can do is, you can have the Hedron Crab, and then you have the Hedge Shredder. You play a land, you trigger the Hedron Crab to mill yourself for 3 cards. Those 3 cards, you should hit at least 1 more land, and then you can target yourself to mill 3 more cards, and then you should hit at least 1 more land, and then you do it again, and you do it again. Eventually, you're going to stack up so much triggers that you will be able to mill your entire deck, and then you start throwing those triggers at your opponent and mill out their entire deck. If you have 30 lands in your deck, you'll mill 30 times 3, a total of 90 cards, which might not quite be enough to mill your entire deck and your opponent's entire deck. Maybe you have like 35 lands just to up the amount that you can mill a little bit. So if you're willing to go land heavy, you could go full on meme mode and just play 4 Hedron Crabs, 4 Hedge Shredders, and the rest of your deck lands, and you'd be guaranteed to win with the combo. Like, if you assemble it and play a land, you're guaranteed to mill. Well, you don't want to say guaranteed, because I guess you could theoretically mill like Hedge Shredder, Hedron Crab, and Fizzle, but like almost guaranteed to just like mill everyone's entire decks and win the game. So I think there's potential there. In less janky world, what about like Pioneer Greasefang? You already have Greasefang that's filling the graveyard to try to get vehicles in the graveyard, so you could maybe mill a Hedge Shredder, get it back into play. You're playing Satyr Wayfinders and Stitcher Suppliers and Grizzly Salvages, all these cards that are filling the graveyard. With Hedge Shredder out, you're going to turn all of that mill into ramp, and then you can just start like casting your Parhelions to win the game. So it works so well in that package. In Modern, like Valakut maybe, where you're like Valakuting with Hedge Shredder and just trying to mill yourself to put all the mountains into play and kill your opponent. You got the Jace, you got Glimpse the Unthinkable, you got Mesmeric Orb, which is ridiculous with this plan because it's going to put the lands into play tapped, and then when they untap, it's even more mill, which is going to be even more lands to power it up for the future. So you can just get so much mana into play with this card. It's super cute with Realms Uncharted. Realms Uncharted, when it was first previewed, people thought this card was going to be busted because it looked like Gifts Ungiven, and Gifts was busted. But Realms Uncharted, for 3 mana, you search for 4 lands with different names. 2 go into your hand, the other 2 go into your graveyard. These are technically going into your graveyard from your library. So if you Realms Uncharted with Hedge Shredder out, you're guaranteed to get 2 lands into play because they're going to go to the graveyard and come into play. The other 2 go into hand, then you can play them from your hand. So that allows you to assemble land combos if you're trying to maybe like Dark Depths and Thespian Stage, or maybe Cabal Coffers and Urborg, or assemble Tron or whatever. This is more or less going to guarantee that you're going to get those lands into play. You can do the same thing with Gifts Ungiven if you want to. Plus, there's just like straight up Dredge. If you've ever played against Dredge in Modern, they can mill their entire deck in the course of like 3 turns maybe, or something like that once it gets going. Imagine that you're not only milling your entire deck, but you end up with literally every land in your deck in play because of Hedge Shredder. Then you can win in all kinds of different ways that Dredge normally couldn't win with. So there are just endless possibilities. In Commander, this card's wild. If you are any sort of self-mill deck, Sidisi, Myco Tyrant, Madroltha, the Necrobloob, Hedge Shredder seems like an absolute auto-include. And remember, I'm treating this like it's essentially a static ability artifact, like a Winter Orb or whatever. Like, I'm not even considering that we can attack with this and mill a couple of cards, which could put lands into play too. So that's an additional upside. This can turn into a 5/5 creature when we needed to. So Hedge Shredder, this is my early pick for most busted card from the set. I have to think that this is going to be like just an absurd build around combo piece, to the point where now it makes a lot of sense that we got Leyline of the Void, because cards like this are so incredibly powerful that if you're not hating on the graveyard, they are just going to steamroll to free win. So I expect this card to see play in Standard, probably Pioneer in Modern, be a Commander staple in those self-mill style decks. It is a ridiculous line of text, like a mind-blowingly strong line of text on this card, and I cannot wait to play with Hedge Shredder. We also got the Swarmweaver. So the Swarmweaver, a 4-mana 2/3 artifact creature scarecrow, also legendary. When it enters, create 2/1/1 black and green insect creature tokens with flying, and then Delirium if there's 4 more card types in your graveyard, which this is pretty good with Delirium since it's an artifact and a creature. Your insects and spiders get +1/+1 and have death touch. So Swarmweaver, it's just a solid card. We've seen many cards like this in the past, like Piancaire Noir, a 4-drop 2/2 that makes 2/1/1 flyers. Whirler Rogue, 4-drop 2/2, makes 2/1/1 flyers. Maverick Thopterus, technically 5 mana, but Improvise makes it cheaper. 2/2 makes some 1/1 flyers. These cards all saw play during their times in Standard, and I expect that the Swarmweaver can see play too. It's just a lot of bodies on the battlefield. It's tokens that can trigger your Caretaker's Talent or whatever. Eventually, those are going to turn into Death Touchers and get buffed thanks to the Swarmweaver once your graveyard's full. So I don't think there's much to say about this card. It's just like a solid card on rate, like a 2/3 that makes a couple of 1/1 flyers and has upside. Traditionally a very playable card. The one place that this does have some synergies is in Commander, because there are insect decks in Commander. So if you're playing like Grist Insects, Zask, Amzu, something like that, then this card goes way up in value because there's not that many good insect making cards. And this is just a reasonable card that makes insects. Plus you can throw in some Delirium synergies if you want to make your team even better. So the Swarmweaver, it just seems like a solid rare. Seems like it should be good and limited. Could see some Standard play. I like that it's 2 card types for Delirium in the graveyard, plus good in insect Commander decks. Speaking of graveyard hate, we didn't just get Leyline of the Void today, we also got Ghost Vacuum, which I think is a Ghostbusters reference, probably. 1-mana artifact. Tap it to exile target card from a graveyard. Then you can pay 6, sack it, put each creature exiled with it on the battlefield under your control with a flying counter, and each of them is a 1/1 spirit in addition to their other types. Only activate it as a sorcery. So Ghost Vacuum, it's a graveyard hate spell, right? It's essentially like an Agatha Soul Cauldron, where you just get to snipe any one creature from the graveyard. It's 1 mana cheaper, which is nice compared to Soul Cauldron. And then the upside is, rather than doing the Soul Cauldron switch around activated abilities thing, you kind of get a Grist the Plague Swarm ultimate, where eventually you pay a bunch of mana, and you get a bunch of 1/1 versions of things that you've exiled with it throughout the game. So Ghost Vacuum, I think it's just a solid hate card. We've been talking about the power of graveyard decks in Standard with Atraxas and Conspiracy Unravelers and Mosswood Dread Knights and now Hedge Shredder. There's a lot of graveyard shenanigans going on. So worst case, this seems like a sideboard all-star. And I think part of what Wizards was trying to do with this card was not just make another Relic of Progenitus or just only a hate card. The last mode of making a bunch of 1/1s with the things that you exiled from it, I think maybe makes this more appealing in Best of One in specific. It definitely makes it more interesting to build around, where this is like a graveyard hate piece, but then you can convince yourself it's actually like kind of fun because you're gonna like do this cool thing eventually with it, which makes it a little bit more enjoyable to play with. It also makes it more realistic to play it in Best of One, where you might not want a card that only snipes things from the graveyard, but this is a thing that snipes things from the graveyard and eventually gives you those things as 1/1 flyers. So I think this is a solid hate piece in Standard. I also think this could see Modern play for one very weird specific reason. So if you look at 1 mana artifacts that hate on graveyards, this actually does something unique, which this is the only one that I can find that snipes exactly the one card that you want from the graveyard repeatedly. We have like Soul Guide Lantern, which does snipe a card when it ETBs, but then just wipes the entire graveyard. Relic of Progenitus, your opponent chooses which card gets exiled. Stone of Eric can exile the entire graveyard, costs some mana. So if you're playing an Urza's Saga deck, this card might actually be the best option for your deck. Depending on the matchup, it doesn't hit your graveyard, you control which card's getting exiled, so you're always going to get rid of that reanimation target, always get rid of that best card. Plus, you don't have to blow it like a Soul Guide Lantern and lose it and then not have graveyard hate in the future when you need it. So if you're playing an Urza's Saga deck that can tutor up a 1 mana artifact, this actually might be the right one in your graveyard hate sideboard slot. Plus, even though this is only going to make 1/1s eventually, if you're sniping reanimation targets like Atraxas and Atalis and Valgavoth, you don't really care too much if they're 1/1s. Like, sure, it'd be nice if you got a 7/7 Atraxa when you sacrifice Ghost Vacuum, but a 1/1 Atraxa still gonna draw you a ton of cards. A 1/1 Atali still gonna let you play some stuff for free. A 1/1 Valgavoth still gonna generate card advantage. So even though you're only getting 1/1s, that 6 mana activation, especially if you have this early and you've stored up a bunch of creatures with it, is probably just gonna win you the game. So Ghost Vacuum, I actually just love this card. It's a hate card, but it's a fun hate card, and I think we should see more of that. More hate cards that serve their purpose for competitive play, but also can do this fun, splashy, casual thing that makes people want to put them in their decks. We also got Grievous Wound, a 5 mana enchantment. It enchants a player. It says enchanted player can't gain life, and whenever enchanted player is dealt damage, they lose half of their life rounded up. So Grievous Wound, I kind of hate this card. I kind of hate this card a little bit. So the card itself, it's fine. It's just like super expensive. So you can shut down a player's life gain, which means it's kind of like a Knight of Dust Shadow or Roiling Vortex, so you don't have to spend a red mana on repeatedly. But 5 mana to shut down life gain is kind of a big ask. That's kind of a lot. It also is kind of cute that you can play this and like get in a hit with a Deep Cavern Bat and make your opponent lose half your life, but that's still, I'm not sure if that's worth building around really. It's kind of funny. It is cool that it doesn't just work with combat damage. That is one of the upsides. But my big criticism of this card is it really should just be a curse. Like, it works like a curse, it looks like a curse, it acts like a curse, but it's not a curse. Instead, it's just an overcosted enchantment that enchants a player. If this was a curse, then you could play it in like Lind and it would be cool. You could find it with Curse of Misfortunes. I know Wizards said their reason to not make it a curse is they view curses as an Innistrad thing, and we're not on Innistrad, so it can't be a curse. I would encourage Wizards in the future, forget about that. Like, if it works like a curse and it looks like a curse, value the gameplay of like improving a Lindak or letting Curse of Misfortunes do its thing over some weird flavor thing that most players don't care about anyway. I don't think any player is gonna like, or many players at least, are gonna see Grievous Wound if it was a curse and be like, curses are only from Innistrad, they shouldn't have done that. I think they're just gonna be happy that they can play it in their Lindak or whatever. As I said, the one thing that does kind of excite me about this card is the fact that it's not just combat damage, which means you can like play this in Nekusar, and whenever your opponent draws a card, it deals 1 damage, but that'll also make that opponent lose half their life. Or imagine gut-shotting for free to take half your opponent's life. So it can do some really funny things, and maybe I'm underestimating how scary losing half your life is every time you take damage. Maybe it'll be better in Standard than I think. I'm going to try to build around it just because I want to see, and we haven't really had an effect like this in Standard ever, I don't think. So I am excited to see if we can actually pull it off. My guess is it's not really a competitive card, and then in Commander, I don't think it's a very good card either because it only targets 1 opponent. So yeah, it's cool that you can wreck, Krim or whatever, because he probably deserves it, or wreck Phil when he's popping off, but it's only really affecting 1 of your opponents, and you have 2 other opponents that aren't being affected. If it was a curse, I would be much more excited about it in Commander. So Grievous Wound should have been a curse. I'm excited to try it in Standard, although I expect that it's not actually going to be a competitive card. And in Commander, it would have many more ramifications if it was a curse. Not being a curse means I think it's probably not going to see much play. Next up, we have Victor, Valgavoth's Seneschal, a 3-mana 3/3 human warlock. It has Eerie. So whenever an enchantment you control enters, or whenever you fully unlock a room, you Severe 2 if it's the first time it's happened this turn. If it's a second time, each opponent discards a card. If it's a third time, put a creature card from a graveyard on the battlefield under your control. So Victor, it wants you to play a lot of enchantments. If you think about what this does, first mode, I guess it's Dimir Informant, ETB, Surveil 2. Maybe the equivalent of drawing a card, although it's a little deceptive to think of it that way, because if you really need that card right away to do something, like a removal spell to stay alive, not going to help you because it's going in the graveyard. But over the course of a game, surveilling 2 repeatedly is a lot of value. If you do it twice, you get a Bugler Rat trigger, make each opponent discard a card, and then the real payoff, 3 enchantments ETB, reanimate a creature from any graveyard. That's the real payoff for this card. So the question is, can you build a deck that is consistently having 3 enchantments enter the battlefield in a turn? If so, then Victor actually seems pretty strong. And we do have a lot of good enchantments in Standard. How easy will it be to have 3 of them entering every turn? That's another question, but like we got Corpses of the Lost, Caretaker's Talent, Case of the Stash Skeleton, Leyline Binding. There's so many enchantments. We got enchantment creatures now, but it still seems tricky to have 3 of them enter during a turn. Like, how are you going to cast 3 Corpses of the Losses in a turn, or 3 Case of the Stash Skeletons? So I think you're going to need some shenanigans where maybe like the Shard tokens from Niko really helps here, the enchantment land really helps here. But if you can build around this, reanimating a creature for free just by playing your deck is kind of busted. There are some shenanigans. I think rolls might be really good with this because rolls are enchantments. So something like a Witch's Vanity is an enchantment that'll trigger Victor and then eventually make a Wicked roll, which will trigger Victor. Or like Lord Skitter's Blessing, an enchantment that immediately makes a Wicked roll. So by itself, that's 2 enchantments for 2 mana, which means you only need 1 more enchantment to trigger the third mode, reanimate something. Mention Niko. Niko makes 2 shards, which are 2 enchantments, so you're 1 away. So like Niko plus the enchantment land in a turn, Lord Skitter's Blessing plus the enchantment land in a turn is enough to fully power up Victor. So there are ways to build around it. Once you get to older formats, or Commander probably, I don't think you're going to do this in Modern, but in Commander there are some enchantments that bounce back to their hand. Like Flickering Ward is the best of the bunch. 1 mana enchantment, you choose a color, gives enchanted creature protection from that color, but you can bounce it back to your hand for 1 mana. So what this means is every turn for 6 total mana, you can fully trigger Victor and Surveil to make your opponents discard and reanimate. So you just like play Flickering Ward, pay 1 to bounce it, play it again, pay 1 to bounce it, trigger the second one, pay 1 again, bounce it, play it again, trigger the third mode. So some of those shenanigans I think will be really cool in Victor, and I kind of love things like this. I love when new commanders make unplayable cards like Flickering Ward into really good cards, and Victor I think actually does it. So I think this is a cool commander, and also like a fine 99 member if you're playing some sort of Orzhov or Abzan Enchantress deck, Daxos or Anathea. I think I'd throw this in the 99 and trust that it's going to generate value, especially good with Anathea because you got the graveyard synergies going as well, where Anathea wants things in the graveyard too, so this surveils to fill your graveyard, gives you a backup plan. So Victor, it's a really cool card. I think we'll see how realistic it is to actually reanimate with it in Standard. Worst case, seems like a really nice commander. We also got Balustrade Wurm. So a 5-mana 5/5 worm creature. It can't be countered. It has trample and haste, and then it has Delirium of 4. Return it from the graveyard to the battlefield with a finality counter on it. Can only do it if you have Delirium. So Balustrade Wurm, I cannot figure out how good this card actually is. It is nice that you can wreck Crim with it. If you're up against a friend who's just always countering your stuff, this is a way to say your counters aren't going to work. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Shifting Ceratops, which saw a lot of play. Its stats are like Reality Smasher, a 5/5 Trample Haster. It even can come back from the graveyard, which is a little like Feasting Troll King. So it's got a lot going for it. These are a bunch of good cards we're looking at right now. The question is, how good will Balustrade Wurm be in Standard? I will say, I don't know if being uncounterable is that much of an upside. We have Thrun, Breaker of Silence, which can't be countered, another 5-mana 5/5, you don't get haste and so forth, but it's harder to kill, and Thrun really hasn't seen much play. We also have Cavern of Souls, so if you're really worried about counters, you don't necessarily have to play Balustrade Wurm. You could just play Cavern of Souls and make your other stuff uncounterable, but I think a 5/5 Trample Haster for 5 traditionally would be good stats. I'm going to be very curious to see if some sort of mono-green stompy deck can be a thing. Just imagine curving Axebane Ferox or flashing in a Colossal Rattleworm, these massive above the curve creatures, and then the next turn Balustrade Wurm smashing in for like 11 damage or 9 damage and just taking your opponent out of the game. So I can see the pieces for this deck. This might be a after Foundations thing where you gotta wait to get the Llanowar Elves, but I do feel like the pieces exist to make some sort of mono green stompy deck a thing. Balustrade Wurm is pretty good against Sunfall, which is nice. Like, sure, your opponent can still Sunfall it away, but at least you're smashing in for that one big attack first. On the other hand, it dies to go for the throw. It dies to get lost. It doesn't have any protection on the battlefield. Like, sure, you're not going to get it countered, but that doesn't stop your opponent from just killing it before they take any damage, and there is a lot of instant speed removal that can deal with this in Standard. So Balustrade Wurm, I'm going to say, I think the card is of a rate where it could be playable, especially if you can turn on Delirium and get it back from your graveyard, then it gets even better. But I think this is a card to keep an eye on. My guess is green is not going to take off until after Llanowar Elves comes out in November. After we get Llanowar Elves, though, let's reevaluate, because then cards like Balustrade Wurm might be kind of busted. So we also got our rare land cycle from the set in the Verge cycle, and it seems like a pretty solid cycle. So these lands always come into play untapped, they always add a color of mana, and then if you control at least one of 2 land types, you make a second color of mana. So Gloomlake Verge, for example, comes in play untap, makes blue, and then if you control an island or a swamp, it'll also make black. So I think these cards are pretty powerful. I see them as kind of like upgraded versions of the check lands or buddy lands, like the Glacial Fortress cycle. I think it's those plus a little bit. They play really well with other dual lands that have land types. So in Standard, we have the Surveil lands, which happen to have 2 land types on them. So a Surveil land's going to make these come into play untapped in the future. Basic land's going to make them come into play untapped in the future. There is some awkwardness about what colors they make on turn 1. Like, for example, we know we're going into Llanowar Elf Standard, right? Hushwing Verge makes green on turn 1, and I can make white later. Thornspire Verge makes red on turn 1, but can make green later. This might subtly push decks in different directions. Like, if you want to be a Llanowar Elf deck, Thornspire Verge is actually pretty bad in your deck because it's not going to let you turn 1 Llanowar, but Hushwood Verge is great in your deck because it's always going to turn 1 Llanowar, so there are some interesting implications here. I think these cards could even see some Fringe Modern play, especially since they just work so well with fetch lands, 4 shock lands, and triomes and surveil lands, since once you fetch out a single land, these are all going to come into play untapped forever, plus they can come into play untapped on turn 1 and make the proper color of mana in the right deck. So seems like a really good land cycle. See a ton of Standard play, maybe some Fringe play outside of Standard. In the realm of lower rarity cards, we got quite a few that deserve a shout out today, starting with Inquisitive Glimmer. So 2 mana 2/3, enchantment creature Fox Glimmer. Says enchantment spells cost 1 less to cast. Unlock costs you pay cost 1 less to cast. So this card probably playable because it looks a lot like Jukai Naturalist in a different color combination, Azorius rather than Celestia. But still, Jukai Naturalist was kind of a staple in enchantment decks before it rotated from Standard, and I think Inquisitive Glimmer can kind of serve a same purpose. Maybe not quite as good as Naturalist because you don't get life gain, but unlocking rooms is a nice little bonus, getting the cost reduction there. So in some sort of Enchantress deck or room deck, I think this could be a card that sees play in Standard. We also got Valgavoth's Faithful, a 1 mana 1/1 human cleric that you can pay for, sack it, return target creature card card from your graveyard to the battlefield only as a sorcery. So this is worth mentioning just because it's technically cheaper than the other reanimation we have in Standard. If you play this and then wait a turn, you can activate it for 4 mana, so you could be reanimating something on turn 4 when Cruelty of Gix, Coiling Rebirth, Fat Emergence is on turn 5. The downside is it's a creature that can die, so if your plan is to run this out early and the next turn activate it, your opponent could just cut down it or whatever, and then you don't reanimate anything. So if you want to do it all in one turn, it is still 5 mana. The other upside is this is a reanimation effect that is also reanimatable, so you can like Abiding Grace to put this back into play every single turn and then sack it to reanimate something, or maybe you unearth it for 1 mana and then reanimate something bigger, or Dewdrop Cure and then reanimate something bigger. So there are some sneaky synergies being a creature rather than being a spell. So I don't think this card's like busted or anything, but it could serve a role in a reanimator deck. We also got Drag to the Root. So 4 mana Golgari instant, destroy target non-land permanent, but if you have Delirium, it costs 2 less to cast, and 2 mana to get any non-land, actually a pretty good deal. So if there's a deck that can consistently Delirium, this could be a staple level removal spell. It's basically Mortality Spear, but for Delirium rather than life gain, but I think that Delirium is a better competitive archetype than Golgari life gain. So if you're getting an Assassin's Trophy out of this, essentially, it seems like a fine card, so worth keeping in mind as a standard playable removal spell. We also got Shard Mage's Rescue, 1 mana aura with flash, and enchants a creature you control. As long as it entered this turn, it gives enchanted creature hexproof, and enchanted creature gets +1/+1. So this is just the new best way to protect one of your creatures from targeted removal in a deck that cares about enchantment. So if you're a Lightpaws deck, a Sethis deck, a Calyx deck, this is a very synergistic way that you can save your commander or your key piece from a targeted removal spell. So if your deck is all about loading a creature up with a bunch of auras, this card is kind of great, should see standard play, and I think could show up back to commander as well. We also got a pretty exciting reprint in Pyroclasm. Pyroclasm, a card that I honestly never expected them to put in standard again. 2 mana sorcery. It's a red card, 2 damage to each creature. So this card, super excited to have it back because it lines up really well with some of the aggro decks in the format. We see these Heartfire Hero all in aggro decks. We see these Go Wide, Convoke, Resolute Reinforcements, Nightmare of Eos decks. Pyroclasm is maybe the best answer now in the format to these decks. 2 damage to everything for 2 mana is a really good rate. If you're in white and you have a temporary lockdown, that's probably better, but if you're not in white, Pyroclasm I think is the new best option as a super aggro sweeper to deal with these very aggressive decks. Speaking of aura decks, we also got Ethereal Armor as another reprint, but this is just a classic way to pump your team if you're loading up on enchantments. 1 mana enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each enchantment you control in first strike. This sees play all the way back to Modern Boggles. It is just one of the best buffs that you can play in an aura deck, because if you're an aura deck or an enchantment deck, you're gonna have so many enchantments, so this is often 1 mana +5/+5, 1 mana +10/+10 in the late game, so it's just making your creature into a ridiculously big threat. We'll have to wait and see. We still have Calyx in standard, so maybe there's some sort of like Calyx deck or Auras deck that develops. Plus, we're getting all these new enchantments in Duskmourn itself, so that's going to help power this up further. So I expect this one will probably see play somewhere in standard, plus it's a fine reprint for other formats. We also got a cute little package of cards that might actually be kind of good in Say Its Name / Altanic the Thrice Called. So Say Its Name, 2 mana, mill 3 cards, then you return a creature land card from your graveyard to your hand, and then you can exile this and 2 other cards with Say Its Name as its name from your graveyard. You search your graveyard and your library for a card called Altanic the Thrice Called, put it on the battlefield. If you search, you gotta shuffle only as a sorcery, and then Altanic, this card I think is actually really good. 7 mana, 9/9 Trampling Insect Bard. When it becomes a target of a spell or ability opponent controls, you draw a card. Most importantly, play 2, discard it, return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield tab. So obviously, I think the like Say Its Name Altanic plan, it'll be interesting to see if this actually takes off. Is mill, I think like cash grab is probably slightly better because you go deeper, but there is some upside to playing Say Its Name as your self-mill spell, and then having 1 Altanic somewhere in your deck that you can just free roll into if you happen to get 3 Say It Names going. So I think that's cute, but I think Altanic might actually just be a good card on its own. 2 mana, discard it to get a land trip back from your graveyard to the battlefield kind of turns this into a standard legal rampant growth. Like, if you can turn 1 Fabled Passage, turn 2, you discard this, get back Fabled Passage, you essentially rampant growth on turn 2. Same with Verdant Catacombs, other fetch lands in older formats. Plus, it works with self-mill stuff. Even in standard, Gnawing Vermin can self-mill on turn 1. Seed of Hope can self-mill on turn 1. So if you can mill over a land, then this becomes turn 2 ramp. So I think Ultinic, in a deck that's based around filling the graveyard, could actually just be a really solid ramp spell. And then it's a ramp spell. They have this upside that in the late game, it's a massive creature, kind of like the Adventure Giant that we used to play, Beanstalk Giant, where for 3 mana you ramp, but in the late game, it's this massive body. Ultinic's kind of the same thing. It ramps you early if you're a deck that can fill your graveyard, and then if you happen to get 7 mana, you just get this huge trampling body. Plus, in older formats, you can do the, like, reanimate shenanigans where you, like, discard this to get back a fetch land, and then you just reanimate this and have a 9/9. I guess it's not, you know, as game ending as maybe drawing a ton of cards with an Atraxa or getting a Grizzlebrand or whatever, but still a 9/9 trampler that's going to draw a card if your opponent targeted is not really a joke, especially when you kind of get it to play it as a ramp spell as well. We also got a card that I kind of wish they didn't print in Turn Inside Out. So Turn Inside Out, 1 red mana instant, target creature gets +3/+0 until end of turn. When it dies this turn, manifest Dread. So I believe Turn Inside Out is now the 2nd best pump spell in Standard, which is pretty relevant because we're in a pretty pump spelly Standard thanks to Heartfire Heroes and Slickshot Show Off. So Turn Inside Out, not as good as Monstrous Rage. That is still number 1 because the Monstrous roll sticks around and it gives trample, but I think this is an upgrade over like Felonious Rage. It kind of does the same thing. The only thing you lose is haste, but I found Felonious Rage's haste to be kind of a fringe thing. I think I'd rather just have an extra power, which is the upside of Turn Inside Out, and then you get to Manifest Dread rather than make a 2/2 detective, which is a strict upgrade there as well, because you can Manifest Dread into something that's even better and then flip it up. So if you're playing one of those pump spell decks, the Gruul decks, the Mono Red decks, the Rakdos decks, I think Turn Inside Out is number 2 behind Monstrous Rage as pump spells that you want to play in your deck, and it's going to make those decks even better. Of course, also plenty of draft chaff that you can check out over at MTGPreviews.com, and we got all the special guests from the set. So special guests, reprints that are themed after the set. Format legality doesn't change outside of cards that are new to Arena, of course, will enter Historic and Timeless. And I gotta say, the art on these cards is so good. Like, that Phantasmal image, my god, is that spectacularly creepy. And some of these cards will be interesting on Arena. Expropriate, kind of wish they didn't print that one because that card's kind of miserable, but it is a commander staple, first time coming to Arena. Sacrifice, very intrigued by this card because we've never really got to play with it because it's only legal in Vintage and Legacy, but 1 black mana, sack a creature, make mana equal to the sacrifice creature's mana value. Imagine like getting on a Mirror Enforcer on the cheap and then sacrificing it to make 7 mana or something. There's gotta be some combo potential here if we think about this. So give me your Magic Arena based Timeless or Historic sacrifice combos, because I think there's gotta be something busted we can do with this card. Maddening Hex, first time on Arena, sees some Legacy play as a finisher, not just Revival, also occasionally sees playing some combo decks, so nothing like super busted here, I would say, with Expropriate and Sacrifice probably being the 2 scariest cards, but some really solid reprints with just super creepy awesome art. Anyway, that brings us to the end of our super huge daily dose of Duskmourn spoilers. So wow, it was a big one. Biggest spoiler day of the set by far. But let me know what you think. We talked about a ton of cards. Which one's your favorite? Now that we're a decent chunk into spoiler season, what are you thinking of the set? What's your hype level? Let me know in the comments. And of course, I'll be back tomorrow with even more Duskmourn spoilers. So until then, everyone, thanks for watching. Have an amazing day, and I will talk to you soon. Looking for even more magic? Well, you can find yesterday's spoiler video here, or maybe check out the video where we found out what was better, a 2024 standard deck or a 2014 modern deck.